In this video, I'll be showing you how to make that textured synth keys patch. This will use some of the techniques we covered in the previous video, but it's going to use them on more synthetic sounding tones. So that way we get this really interesting hybrid of a sampler and also a synthesizer patch, using some of those interesting features available inside of Omnisphere. So this will have two individual layers, and by the way, if you're curious about those notes, that's what's going on with that arpeggio pattern. Just some real simple chords and then kind of moving up the scale in this ascending and then descending pattern just to create a musical sequence. I'll include that MIDI in the download with the course materials if you'd like to follow along that way. And let's go ahead and open up Omnisphere and jump into our patch. So as I said, this is going to have two different layers, the first of which is going to be a sample synth layer, and then we'll add in a more ambient layer next. So with the initialized blank patch, let's go over to our tab here, and we're also just on the first layer as well, and go to A. We're going to go over to sampler, and we're going to go ahead and grab a sample from a vintage synthesizer patch. And it's actually going to be the Casio VL tone, so you can either type this in or click it from the source material over here. And we are looking for the Casio VL tone Fantasy, which was a synth patch on this keyboard / calculator that Casio made. I think it was in the 80s. There's a point in time where Casio made some weird synthesizers, and this had this kind of cool lo-fi tone that sounds like this, which is really great, especially once you start loading it into Omnisphere. You can really edit this and create all sorts of really cool lo-fi keys patches. And if you don't see this over here on the left-hand side, just go ahead and type this into the search bar at the top, and you can go ahead and load up that sample. So I'm gonna double click on that, make sure it's loaded, hit the X, and that will close that out. And we can begin messing around with our sampler. So let's go ahead and first add in some unison, which will really thicken up the synth tone. It will give us a totally different tone that wasn't available on the synth as well. So I can click this, go to unison, turn that on, and then listen to what this sounds like. So it's giving us this really cool detuning. We probably want less of that detuning so there's less movement. I just want like a little bit of that. So we'll do 0.012. Actually, let's just put that all the way down. Without it. So it gives us this kind of cool like detune tone. Maybe add just a little bit more of that. Just play around with it a little bit until you get something you like. Okay, that sounds cool. It almost has this weird like ring modulated tone to it. And that is 0.30. So that's the value. So 0.030. We can close it out. And then we could start playing around with our amplifier envelope. So we want this to be more of a pluck like what we heard in the introduction. So let's go over to our amplifier. Let's drop that sustain all the way down. And then I want like a really nice and short pluck. So we'll put that at like just about there. Let's also put the release up. I'll give you those exact values here in a moment. So we'll have the decay at 0.434 and the release at 0.927. So that gives us this nice pluck. And then whenever I release the key, it rings out because of that release. So if you want to adjust how long that sound rings out, play around with this release parameter because that'll give you that adjustment. And then let's go ahead and filter this as well. So there's more of like a filter pluck happening. So let's go over to our filter. I'm gonna drop that all the way down. We could just leave this on the basic 12 decibel per octave filter low pass. And right there, that already gives us a much rounder tone. Let's go ahead and increase the keyboard tracking all the way up. Take that envelope down. And now we have this really warm, weird synthetic tone, which I quite like the sound of. So that final value, that's all the way up, and then that is at 0.330. And then we could play around with our filter just to get a little bit more flavor out of it. Let's reduce the sustain just a touch, and also play around with that decay to give us various different pluck tones. Play around with that a little bit shorter. I like that. So that's 1.70 or 1.70 seconds in this case. I'm going to turn this down just a little bit because we will be layering this in with another synth. We can always play around with these different levels a little bit later to kind of balance everything so it's all a bit more integrated. But we can revisit that if we need to. And then I want to start playing around with some effects just on this first layer. Because Omnisphere has a lot of different effects capabilities, especially when it comes to layering different sounds together. So we're going to go over to Effects. And we're going to go off of this common page. We want to go down to A. This is going to be effects that are just for layer A. And then layer B is just for layer B, layer C, and D. So this enables us to just add effects to this first synth instance here. So we're going to add a little bit of compression, which will kind of tighten that up just a little bit, and it will also add a little bit of volume as well. So let's do the modern compression because we're looking for something just nice and snappy. And we could probably just really use this as a gain control. So I'm just going to leave it as default state. It's really just kind of tightening it up. So it's not adding a ton of compression, and unfortunately there's no compressor icon here on this device. So you can't tell the exact gain reduction, but we can hear just a little bit of compression being added in. And that kind of just tightens up that synth sound and also just gives us a little bit of volume to play with. And then I'm going to make that nice and chorusy, so we're going to add the analog chorus. And depending on the type of flavor you're going for, you could always mess around with this. We'll just leave it as is. Probably just drop that down just a little bit though, maybe like 40% on the mix. So that way the chorus is a little bit less intense. And then we're going to add just a little bit of a mid cut here with a parametric EQ. So that way we don't have any buildup. So we're going to go over to the gain control and maybe move that like at 100 or so. So we'll do -10 decibels. And it kind of just cleans up that mid-range stuff that's a little bit floppy sounding. So that way we have a much cleaner synth tone to work with. And then it's time to add in that interesting, almost washy ambient layer that you heard in the introduction. So we'll go over to layer B. I'm going to hit sample. I'm going to turn this one off and turn this one on right here so we can just hear our first. So we just hear that second layer as we're working on it, and then we'll blend it in with the other one. We'll go to sample, and I'm looking for, I think it's under ARPs and code technically, but it's going to be called Pool of Skin was the name of the sample. So just type that in and you get this sample right here, which sounds like this. Which has like a sine wave tone, it's some noise. And that's a super interesting texture that we can then layer in with our instruments. So the first thing we'll do is adjust the start position, because if we listen to this right here, and we put this all the way over, we can get more towards that like sine wave tone, which gives us more of like an actual playable pluck. Whereas this is kind of playing more of that noise at the start. So we're going to put that all the way over to the right. And then I want to add just a cut on that release, the sustain down, and I want this to be more like just a little pluck. Because we're using this kind of like we did with that piano layer in the other video, where it's just that initial little attack transient. There's also a ton of low end in here. And we don't want all that sub bass, especially because we're making a lead patch. So let's go over to our filter, go ahead and turn that on. And then we want to use a high pass filter because we want to chop out that low end. So let's go ahead and click on this. We'll go to our high pass filter category, and you have all these different ones to choose from, each of which have its own unique sound. Here, I want to go ahead and have a pretty aggressive cut on the low end because I'm just trying to chop all that stuff out. So we're going to use the Juicy 48 decibel per octave filter, which is going to be a very steep cutoff curve. Turn the resonance all the way down, turn the key tracking down, and the envelope. So that way we're not getting any movement happening on this filter. So any notes I play, it's always just staying in the same position. Let's add a little bit of gain as well, just so we have a bit more volume. And then we want to go ahead and just chop out that low end stuff. So maybe at like 0.252. Let's go ahead and just turn this down a little bit. And that way it's more of a texture element that we're then layering in with this nice pluck. Whereas if it didn't have the filtering, kind of not really sitting with the actual synth sound, it doesn't sound like it's one singular instrument. It sounds like it's multiple things happening at the same time. Once we really filter that out and add a little bit of gain, create something that's a lot more interesting. And then it's time to take both of those layers and press them together with just a little bit of effects. And that way we can take both of those synth instances and make them actually sound like they're one singular instrument. And then we can adjust the blending on everything with these volume controls if we need to. So I'm going to go over to my effects tab, and I'm going to go to common. So that way it applies to both layers A and B and any other layers that you have loaded up into Omnisphere. We're going to apply a little bit of equalization. We're not going to go too crazy with this. I'm just looking to cut out some more upper frequency harmonic stuff, and then also make sure that there's no extended low end in here because it is a pluck. So on band 1, we're going to look for the high pass filter. So we're going to click on this, and then from that drop down, we get this high pass filter, and then we're going to go ahead and adjust this frequency. So So that's chopping out all that low end stuff. And we just want this to be at like 40, maybe 41. Put it down just a little bit. But basically what that's going to do is just chop out any low end stuff. So we're playing into these lower notes. We don't get a ton of sub bass. And that kind of just helps add a little bit of clarity to everything. And then we could probably take some of that resonance down to, I think at about like 1000, you heard this stuff. Let me go and just crank that a little bit. It's kind of just like a little weird, harsh resonance. There we go, that's where it is. So it's like, in our case, I think like 7 or 800, 805. Make it a little narrower. There we go. And I want this to be at peaking. So that way it's just grabbing that individual resonant harmonic, and we want to pull that back because it's a little bit extreme sounding. And then now we can go ahead and put this back up to 0 or close to 0. So that way it's back up to its volume. And then to add a nice kind of spacey sound to it, we're going to add in just a touch of delay. I want this to be synced to the project's BPM. So we're going to add in the BPM delay, which gives us 1 beats per minute synced delay unit that we can use. And I want to go ahead and adjust this. So the cool thing is you can either swap through these different options here on this menu, or you can click on this and select them, which I find is a little bit quicker. So I'm going to do a 16th note delay, which is a little bit faster. So it gives me that kind of multi-tap sound. And then I want to go ahead and increase that feedback quite a bit. So we do 0.60 or 0.600. So that way it has a nice ring to it. And then you could always play around with the tone control, just depending on the type of tone you're going for. But we'll go ahead and leave that as default state. Take it down just a little bit. And that gives you that nice bounce, which makes that whole patch feel a lot more interesting. Because without it, pretty dry sounding, but with just a little bit of that delay, it's a lot more interesting. And now we have a patch that sounds actually super cool. So altogether, the patch sounds like this. Then from there, if you'd like to go in and adjust it, let's say you wanted less of that kind of washy noise, you could click into the second layer, reduce it. So depending on what works best for your production, you can always go in and adjust that. So that's all for this textured keys patch, showing off various different ways of layering synthetic elements, then using some of those interesting sampler features to create sounds that are a lot more engaging, even though you're just using like synth samples essentially. So thanks for checking out this video. I'll see you in the next one.